So friends, the context of this lecture by Professor Payal Nagpal is the early 20th century, which is rooted in the 19th century context, and therefore the world in Agatha Christie, the way it appears, is intelligible. Is something that one can find out the character, the features of the world that surrounds us. We can use our mind to understand its real nature, its true essence. And if that is entertaining, if that is witty, if that shows kind of sharp intellect, then of course it's doubly rewarding. So I request Professor Pal Nagpal to make points further regarding this as well as other points that she has to make.
Yes. So, one of the important points that Christie brings in her writing is about a kind of reasoning that is there. So, the case is resolved through a process of reasoning. There is, none of the high literature interiority here, but there is a thought process that is at work. And again, I'd like to make a connection here with 19th century writing, which is that of observation. So where observation is really speaking the key to a kind of realism that we experience in 19th century writing. So this is not crime writing, detective fiction does not replicate that, but uh, the case that we are making here is that it actually takes some of the aspects of, because 19th century realism is very layered, very complex, and works at many other levels. So some of the methods, in a sense, and the techniques are taken from there. So for example, if we look at how the method works, so Inspector Japp asks Miss Plendelith, you didn't try and look through the keyhole, and she says, I never thought of that. But I couldn't have seen anything because the key would have been in it. And, she immediately says this, and Poirot, whose mind has been working, he smiles suddenly to himself because, he's understood exactly what has happened with respect to the key. So, and he asks that, well, you certainly don't think that she would have committed suicide. And Poirot said gently, you were fond of your friend. He saw the hand clench on her knee, the tightening of the line of the jaw, yet the answer came in a matter-of-fact voice, free from emotion. You're quite right, I was. So uh, here the detective has observed the physical aspects about what her immediate physical response is to his question, and there is, instead of a kind of tender moment, instead the hand clenches on the knee, and he realizes that where she's kept her voice very matter of fact, but there is a kind of tension in her body. So it is this power of observation that the detective is supposed to have. So and then it appears that what can pass off as evidence is the cufflink that is located, and they can't. There are these Turkish cigarette stubs and the cufflink that provides some kind of a clue, but they're not able to connect it. So and Inspector Japp says that they're confused because they think that this young woman, that is Miss Plendelith, she knows something. And Poirot also says that this is a kind of that is obvious, and why is it that she's not really saying anything? So they try to then connect the dots, which means that observation, analysis is what allows the detective to connect the dots. And again, this it's remarkable that what started with Poe and it was built up by Doyle is something, a skill that is honed within what is called classical detective writing by Agatha Christie. So they wonder who's the last person really speaking, who must have seen her. And here is something that Christie is known for in her writing is how there is this English uh, assumption superiority, and all else are sidelined in terms of race, ethnicity, and so on.
Would
So,
you for
for
a short
instance,
while compare Doyle with Christie in terms of method, in terms of observation, as you are referring to?
Yes, where actually with Doyle, the eccentricity, I think, is an important aspect of the detective. In the case of uh, Agatha Christie, I think it's more an eccentricity, really speaking, of the mind, in the sense that, there is also tremendous balance actually. So the eccentricity is built up very differently. So, we don't have Sherlock Holmes lying on the couch and, in his, he's consuming something and he's in his own
He has flashes
sense
of
of
imagination and
flashes
all,
of imagination.
but she is stuck to the reality in
She's
front of
stuck
her.
to the reality, and everything is being, in a sense, inductive reasoning, it's being understood analytically.
Hmm.
So, this, I think, is her method. And
Could you explain this inductive reasoning method? Because this is really fascinating
yes,
in her.
so basically the whole, it's not simply looking, it's not deductive in that sense that, you just look at something and calculate, but the power of observation that first and foremost presents the entire canvas to you, and then you analytically, the process of thinking, observation is then coupled with this process of thinking and analysis.
And things are happening in front of the person, and the person is constantly in touch with reality,
Yes,
which is moving.
which is moving.
Mhm.
And here, another aspect of Christie's writing, apart from the method, is how the English assume this air of superiority. And so, for instance, in this very story, Murder in the Mews, Inspector Jameson preserved a respectful silence. His face said with British superiority, "Foreigners," and he's referring to Hercule Poirot here. Aloud he said, "So that is Mr. Hercule Poirot, I've heard of him. Old friend of mine, not half as balmy he looks." All the same, he's getting on now. Gone a bit gaga, as they say, sir, is what he's saying. So, here somebody who's much junior, that's Inspector Jameson, is also quite, convinced about his own position. And which is why I think Christie, in presenting to us a Belgian detective, is also kind of offering a critique of the English context of rationality, reasoning, and the assumptions that go along with it, because this is also the time, I mean, the whole idea at the turn of the century of the white man's burden and so on is all there. But all these come in her writing as, I mean, I wouldn't call it a subtext really speaking, but they are there for us to see and to read, and they form part of the entire paraphernalia, in a sense, of detective writing.
Well, can you say something? Can you also comment on the handling of the dialogue by her? Because there are two people, three people talking,
Yes.
and none is certain, but together they move and they move towards a conclusion.
So if you actually look at this, what is very interesting is that it's not as if Hercule Poirot, who's the detective, is really saying a lot. He's not speaking as much, but he's observing. We are constantly seeing him, and if as reader we choose to kind of follow him through the story, we see him observing, and what's going on is in his mind. And whereas, again, in terms of I think the whole process of solving a case, the whole English method, really speaking, of asking questions and relying on those answers, minus this power of observation, I think is presented as quite deductive, as deductive reasoning, and appears quite reductive in a sense. So that does not lead us to the correct answer, in a sense.
Would you agree that the character, Poirot, for instance, is being presented as as a thematic point, but this is how people's mind works? Is that at the center of her fiction?
I think what she's presenting in Poirot is that this is how people's minds probably should work, and this is how a case
Oh.
should be solved. And but people have probably also dumbed and numbed their powers of thinking. So I think, but this is where so the dialogue is there, And the dialogue, as mentioned, if we want to compare it with realist writing, then it's more, we have almost, equal description and dialogue here. But the detective is, Hercule Poirot is more about, quietly observing and asking very specific, pointed questions. Uh, Whereas with Miss Marple, we of course have, the detective as the old woman, who's also at times talking a lot and is
Please
engaging.
say something about this character, Miss Marple,
Uh,
as a
yes, if
detective.
I get,
Yes.
I just complete the last
Okay.
part of this
Okay.
and
Okay.
move on to Miss Marple.
Mm.
So here again, a new trajectory begins. When they finally hit a dead end and are not sure about what happens in Murder in the Mews. So a new trajectory begins, and they question Jane Plendelith and arrive at the conclusion. They realize that her friend was actually being blackmailed. So, and Barbara Allen was being blackmailed. So she thinks about the money, and she thinks about the fact that she had borrowed some money from her, and so on and so forth. Now, an important point that I want to, which is there in the Christie stories and the narrative, is the red herring trick. So here what happens is, now, as we already know, that it is Jane Plendelith who had tried, because she loved her friend so much that she tried to present this as a murder, and whereas it was not. And so there is the red herring trick, where they suddenly open the cupboard, and in the cupboard what they see is, and I'd like to read this out, three umbrellas. There was not very much in the cupboard. Three umbrellas, one broken, four walking sticks, a set of golf clubs, two tennis rackets, a neatly folded rug, several sofa cushions, and on top of these reposed a small, smart-looking attaché case. So the giveaway here would actually have been the golf clubs, because Barbara is holding the gun in her right hand, whereas actually she was left-handed, and these were her golf clubs, and so they would have been, but she deflects the attention, to the attaché case, and both Inspector Japp and Poirot, much as he's unsure about it, momentarily they fall for the red herring trick. And they almost start referring to the case as the mystery of the small attaché case. So here I think Christie also warns us that what very strongly appears to be, a clue, is actually only a means of deflecting attention. So the detective is somebody who has to be extremely balanced about it. So um, and so in this way, when they finally realize that, when they find out that she had gone to, she'd taken the golf clubs, that's when Poirot realizes, and he says, of course, but naturally, what an imbecile I am. Why, it leapt to the eye. So what had leapt to the eye was the golf club, but the red herring, that is the attaché case, deflected attention. And finally, he says that the golf clubs had gone. Naturally, the girl isn't a fool, whatever she is. Anything else gone? And so again, the attaché case is also gone, because she decided to keep up the pretense. And so a lot of clues that finally take them to the end, to finally reveal, really speaking, what had happened. And there is a reference to Sherlock Holmes here in the story, or Sherlock Holmes did the same. He drew attention, they say, remember, to the curious incident of the dog in the night time, and the answer was that there was no curious incident. So from Guy Fawkes to no curious incident, to the pen tray, and many such clues tell them that, of course, Major Eustace was blackmailing her, but he had not really, killed her. So it is, as he says, not murder disguised as suicide, but suicide made to look like murder. She tries to focus our attention on the wrong object, and she says of the attaché case, that's mine. So this brings us to the end of the story, and we move to the the parallel detective, that is Miss Marple. And there's an interesting story. This is written between 1939 and 1954, which means we are now looking at a story of the post Second World War period. And these stories were published only in 1979. They are referred to as Miss Marple's final cases. Now, with Miss Marple, we see language used in an entirely different way. The kind of precision and rationality we see in Hercule Poirot is worked out very differently in the case of Miss Marple. There is, the dialogue is profuse, it's intense, but never does Miss Marple lose sight of the objectivity that is expected of a detective. But in terms of characterization, it is a very, very different character. So, and this is from the story, Miss Marple tells the story. I don't want to seem vain in any way, of course. I know that in comparison with you young people, I am not clever at all. Raymond writes those very modern books and so on, and Joanne paints those very remarkable pictures. Very clever of you, my dear. But as Raymond always says, only quite kindly, I am hopelessly Victorian, is what she says. So I think this, in a sense, and if you just go through these lines, they tell us how she's presented as a very ordinary, the woman next door, the old woman next door, in a sense. But the mind is constantly ticking and analyzing and observing. So this is, the way in which Miss Marple is really presented as a very different character.
So the writer has given a kind of role to her, that she has to look inside herself, she has to present things from her point of view, and that in her approach she would be autobiographical. That I'm half as bad as good as you. You are young people. I am
Yes.
old, and all those things.
Yes.
So self-aware, but at the same time cunning enough, clever enough to make her own point, and that point is going to be qualitatively different from the listeners. This is how I understand the character.
Yes. And with Miss Marple, we'll also see, like, a kind of stereotype of the woman. She'll probably do all the things that any ordinary woman her age would be doing, like
How old
baking
is she?
cakes. Exact age is not something that I would be able
I
to.
think 65.
Somewhere around that time, that age, 60s maybe.
Will she walk straight, or just sit down and?
Well, she would take her time. She would walk straight, and she would also, kind of take those gaps and pauses that age would make her do. But at the same time, she would, let's say, take a lot of interest in what is cooking, and maybe something like jam making or so on. So she would engage in all these things, and at the same time, her mind captures the it is so active that it captures everything.
Does she offer a kind of contrast to Poirot as a person?
I think as a person, yes. As a person, these are two different people. But in terms of their mind and the analysis that they conduct, I think they are similar in that sense. Their methods would be different, but the mind is, of course,
Poirot, I think, is argumentative, and she is observant. Or how do you define them?
No, Poirot certainly would be argumentative, but it is something that is again carrying out more in his mind. It's not, he's careful with the words that he uses. And he would like it to be brevity, in a sense, is what I would associate with. Pointedness is what I would associate with Poirot. But with Miss Marple, I think she's endearing. She's somebody you relate to. She's somebody you want to have a long conversation with. So that's the kind of woman that Miss Marple is. But
would she understand sympathetically the character of the assassin, murderer, the violent person?
Yes, she would understand everything very sympathetically. But all these things, the very fact that one would, she herself would have long conversations with the people around, but nothing takes away from that very active mind that is also observing and trying to connect the dots. That is there. So we have two very different, detective characterizations.
She would enjoy life. She would talk very pleasantly to people.
Very pleasant.
And she can use that pleasantness in order to get things out of the other people's minds.
Yes.
Is that the case?
Yes.
This is entire, as you rightly say, this is an entirely different character.
Entirely different character. In fact, sometimes, she would approach, let's say somebody very simply and have a conversation. And in the course of that conversation, she would get her clue what she wants.
Mm.
So, this style of conversation is also, I think it should be included in the method of Miss Marple. So it's part of her.
You have called her characters endearing characters.
Yes.
An example of that, if you can.
So for instance, I'll just, here kind of bring in the story, Miss Marple. Now, this is a very different kind of a story, because here the case is not happening in front of us. So there is going to be, one person is going to be charged with the murder of his wife, and his friend, who knows Miss Marple, recounts what had happened. And it is in this process of recounting and the questions that Miss Marple asks that she is able to solve the case. So she does not physically visit it. She does not visit the site of the murder. She does not meet anybody, but she only asks a set of questions. And it is through these questions that she solves the case. This is very different from actually going there, being a part of the scene. So, which means again that the whole process of the kind of questions that she asks and the way in which she analyzes, I think that is what. So, if we take a look at this, Miss Marple, he said, you must forgive an old friend for taking a liberty as he has come for a consultation. And so, she of course at times digresses and talks about other things. So, Mrs. Rhodes, I gathered, she says, was one of those romantic liars who go through life embroidering everything that happens to them. The amount of adventures that, according to her own accord, happened to her in a year was simply incredible. Her husband got into the habit of discounting, if she's presented as somebody, Mrs. Rhodes is presented as somebody who's very hysterical. Now, here is a woman who maybe was in a habit of, or was understood to be in a habit of exaggeration. But her actual concerns, when she conveyed them to her husband ignored it and thought that it was, possibly just an exaggeration. And that, of course, cost her her life. So, there was a woman she was a very bad driver, and there was a woman whose daughter she had run over. And so this woman, who also had a case of, mental illness in the family, so, decides to actually kill Mrs. Rhodes. But how this is done and how this is solved is another thing altogether. So, and in this, I think this is where Agatha Christie and Miss Marple, the character, her perspective as a woman, I think, emerges here. So, the very fact that the husband ignores whatever she's saying. If a lampshade caught fire, she was rescued from a burning building. Her husband got into the habit of discounting her statements. Her tale as to some woman whose child she had injured in a motor accident and who had vowed vengeance on her. Mr. Rhodes had simply not taken any notice of it. So, this is where I think Agatha Christie as a writer is also kind of bringing in the woman's perspective.
And a kind of, dig at the cost of her husband.
Yes, totally, totally. So, the woman, on the other hand, who kills Mrs. Rhodes, it's said that she had hysterical tendencies. So, now Miss Marple is also, when she comes to solving the case, she is as analytical and as crystal clear as any classical, classic detective. So here she says there are 4 possibilities. Either Mrs. Rhodes was killed by her husband or by the chambermaid, or she committed suicide, or she was killed by an outsider. And so, by getting to know the arrangement of the maid, the rooms, and who are the parlor maids and chambermaids who come in and go out, Miss Marple is able to solve the case successfully. So, at one point she says that you would not remember which chambermaid it was. So, there is one person who goes and probably the killer dressed as the chambermaid who comes out. So, Miss Marple says you wouldn't see her. Now, where Hercule Poirot would probably just use one sentence to sum it up, Miss Marple of course says And this is where her power of observation as a woman comes in. So she tells the men that, they will not probably, the fact that it's a chambermaid, it will not register. She says, that's where you are wrong. You wouldn't see her, not if she were dressed as a chambermaid. You were engrossed in your work. Out of the tail of your eye, you saw a chambermaid come in, go into your wife's room, come back and go out. It was the same dress, but not the same woman. And then finally, when she solves the case, the indication is of the two women, one woman would have done it. So there is a woman who's presented as dropping her G's. So then finally, Miss Marple's friend asks her that, what made you think that it is the woman who drops her G's? She's the one who's, the killer. So she gives a very interesting answer to this. And I think this explains Miss Marple as a detective.
Vivacity.
Yes. And so she says, well, it was the G's. You said she dropped her G's. Now that's done by a lot of hunting people in books, but I don't know many people who do it in reality. You said this woman was 40. These dropped G's sounded to me like a woman who was playing a part and overdoing it.
Please conclude it from the point of view of which character you would like to overstate, or which other character you would like to put in the background.
So I think first and foremost, it's important that we engage with what is categorized as popular writing to understand the reader of the time. And I think Agatha Christie, as a woman who brings to us an entirely different style of writing, which is that of detective fiction, and presents to us two very, very interesting characters, both in a sense displaced from the mainstream English sensibility, one being a Belgian detective and one being a woman who's a spinster. So I think these are two very important aspects. And of course, I find Miss Marple extremely endearing for the way in which she conducts, her, questioning, the way in which she goes on to analyze the cases, and at the same time, Hercule Poirot for his crispness in, I think, in being argumentative, in his crispness in solving the cases. So, and of course, this kind of writing that is at a complete, polar opposite to the kind of writing, mainstream writing in terms of canonical writing, I would say, that took place around that time.
So friends, Professor Payal Nagpal has presented this writer who is basically of the longer fiction, also writing the short fiction, and there also she maintains the same kind of excellence that she presents elsewhere, and the kind of imaginative sharpness that is there in the writer that has been presented fascinatingly by Professor Payal Nagpal. So I hope you would have definitely enjoyed, and you'd like to now read some short stories by her from the point of view of what Professor Payal Nagpal has said. Thank you.